What's going on, guys? Waco from Revolution here at the Revolution Watch Bar with Constant Kwong. And the first thing we want to say is Happy Chinese New Year.
Happy New Year, guys.
Wishing you guys an incredible year, a very prosperous 2024.
So, Dragon year as well.
Dragon year,
yeah.
dude. So for those of you who are having babies this year, also eat lively best, right? Because
yeah.
you're going to have a dragon baby. Oof.
Yeah, man.
We want to talk to you about a watch we consider to be one of the most important chronographs of all time. It is the Rolex Daytona 100th anniversary of Le Mans, reference 126529.
Yes, 529. Yes, that's correct.
And it is, in fact, this watch right here.
Oh man, check out that beautiful watch.
Let's talk about why I love this watch so much.
Okay,
so it is to me the first moment where Rolex has looked back at its entire history with the Daytona and said, okay, let's take all the elements that we love best over the entire history of the 60 years of the Daytona.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, let's go back to 2000. We had the creation of the reference.
116520, stainless steel Daytona.
Okay, so this watch was really important because it was the first time that Rolex had an in-house chronograph movement inside that watch.
That's correct, yeah.
And it was the legendary reference
4130, yeah.
Right? And this caliber was really interesting because it was a vertical clutch movement, which meant you could leave it on as long as you wanted without affecting the underlying amplitude of the balance.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was constructed to be as simple as possible, right? So it was as easy to service as possible. And we have an example of that watch. This is my personal 116508, right? Otherwise known as the...
John Mayer.
Okay. So this watch is really interesting to me because for 25 years, it is basically the watch I thought of as a Daytona. For a quarter of a century, or almost a quarter of a century, this iconography is what we think of when we think of the Daytona. And in 2000, this watch was really quite like muscular and a little bit aggressive. You know, it was like, it had taken a lot of the codes of this watch actually, which is the 16520, right? Which is launched in 1988, and we'll show you, this watch at close up, right? And that watch is the first ever automatic Rolex Daytona, which is incidentally the watch that created the hype. The first watch that had like the 2-year waiting list, so on and so forth. And the stainless steel model of this watch was like the biggest trophy of back in the day.
It is,
right? So, but it took a lot of its basic design cues from this. Obviously the counters are arrayed differently because of the different movement with the 4130. And it kind of just made it more aggressive and muscular.
It is, yeah.
It was as if like this watch decided that it wanted to go like take like protein supplements,
decided to
hit the weight bench, right? Like was doing HIIT training, was like,
It is very aggressive. I mean, when this watch was launched, it introduced the first ever time that Daytona is in this beefed up 40mm case. First time in 40mm with automatic movement, and of course the introduction of the crown guards as well.
Absolutely. But I have to say that this watch is, in some ways you can see that its lineage relates to its predecessor, but it's its own watch completely, right? The muscularity and angle profile of this case is stunning. The thickness of the bezel, the like high legibility of the print that you have on this gold bezel. And bear in mind, in 2016, Rolex also did a huge evolution to this model by launching the Cerachrome ceramic bezel as well, right? If you look at the visibility that's represented by these oversized like counters, the thickness of the indexes, the thickness of the hands. I like in diving watch terms, they always say maxi. When you have a maxi dial, when you have thicker indexes and thicker.
Yeah, I would say that this is a maxi version of the vintage Daytona.
Exactly. Right? But it was a phenomenal watch. To my belief, I actually felt that you couldn't do possibly a better Daytona than this. No, seriously. Like I used to wear this watch and I was like, this is perfection. There's no way that Rolex will ever be able to improve on this watch. They shouldn't probably even bother trying, but then they did, and in 2023 they launched the new reference, and my God, that watch is beautiful. Right? So what do I love so much about the 126529? Throughout its like history, people always think of Rolex as just moving purely forwards, right? They always think that Rolex doesn't really like embrace its history. It's always like it has its eyes firmly set on the future. And of course that's really true. I mean, a lot of that is also like, for example, its internal chronometric tests, right? It's standard being minus and plus 2 seconds a day, right? And part of that is also improvements that you see even down to the escapement of the watch. So the big difference between the movement in here, the 4130, and in the 4131, which is in all the other new Daytonas, and the 4132 here because it has the 24-hour counter is the addition of the Chrono G escapement. Let me tell you a little bit about the Chrono G escapement. It was actually launched in 2015 in the 40mm day date of all things, right? And I always like that because Rolex kind of stealth launches like technology.
Yeah,
because it's like you're not like looking at that watch and be like, it's going to be the most accurate Rolex of all time. But eventually that Chrono G escapement started to go into other watches, and as of last year, it went into the Daytona as well, right? So the cool thing about the Chrono G escapement is actually a reinterpretation of the Swiss lever escapement, right? And instead of having thicker pallets, it's got very thin pallets. It's got a slightly thicker tooth with a slightly different profile as well, and that profile helps to reduce sliding friction. Also, the entire escape wheel and the anchor are lighter, reducing inertia as well, and that adds up to a 15% savings in terms of efficiency.
Wow. Okay, that's really cool. And I think that the some of the parts are skeletonized as well, right?
Well, actually, not just skeletonized, but actually created using Liga, which is a process of photolithography to build out parts with nickel phosphorus.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's cool.
It's cool. It's really cool. It's a very modern technology, you know. And so the addition of this escapement into the Daytona movement for the first time represents a big step up. But that's talking about the internal content of the watch. Let's talk about the beauty of the external content of the watch.
Okay.
Because it is, to my mind, the most beautiful Daytona of all time. And I love the fact, as I was talking about before, that for the first time, Rolex is overtly referencing its past. And when I say that, it's because you have these incredible Paul Newman style markers inside of these three subdials.
Paul Newman Daytona dial, basically, or known as exotic dial before it was called. It's an outer rim outside the inner dial. And of course, the sub-dials on that special exotic dial or Paul Newman dials has this really special square shape what I call it, markers in a way in the sub-dials, which is unique actually to the exotic dials.
So incredibly unique and so wonderfully distinct, and they're almost kind of like Art Deco, like
I will put them in the Art Deco kind of style.
Yes. So what is incredible is that for so many people who love the Rolex Daytona, the dream is that one day Rolex would one day recreate the Paul Newman Daytona.
Yes, it's true.
Right? To take those famous markers, to take the three-color idea, and to bring it into a modern platform, or to bring it into a modern watch.
Actually, I want to mention something, right? In the modern world, there's a 116508, which is also a full gold one, or 1518 with oyster flags. That also that came before this, I think launched in 2016 as well. But the color code, they call it the Paul Newman, but it was not exactly the Paul Newman
No,
dial.
because it didn't have Paul Newman styling to it.
Yes,
or it didn't have the hash marks that we're talking about.
Yes.
For so many years, you've had fans of the Daytona who dreamt about Rolex one day creating a modern version of the Paul Newman, right? And now they finally did, right? I mean, for lack of a better explanation as to why people are so insanely crazy about this watch, it's because that Rolex has finally created a modern Paul Newman, right? It's taken those hash markers and applied it to the three subdials, which incidentally, instead of a normal 12-hour counter, you now have a 24-hour counter. Okay, so let's talk about the name a little bit as well, because Le Mans is a 24-hour endurance race, probably the most famous endurance race of all time, right?
It is, yeah.
It is famously the race where Ford, beat Ferrari. It's the race where the McLaren F1 came in first, second, and third. I think it was the famous result for that car. It's the battleground where some of the most famous races have ever taken place. Initially, when Rolex launched its chronograph back in 1963, right, it didn't have the word Daytona associated with it first, right? I think it was just called a Cosmograph, right?
It was called Cosmograph, and it's called a Cosmograph, actually just a Cosmograph.
Right. But last year, out of nowhere, after it dropped the entire series of 1, 2, 6, 500 watches, right, and everyone had already gone crazy of them, and this included the platinum version, which has a see-through case back. In June that year, Rolex just dropped this watch, and people just lost their minds. But it dropped this watch with a reason. It was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Le Mans race, which it now officially has a partnership. So Rolex did something very, very cool to celebrate this. What did it do?
Yes, they changed normally a normal Daytona, all the other Daytonas that exist now has a 12-hour counter on the chronograph. But this particular one uniquely has a 24-hour counter instead. Right?
That's pretty cool, right? And I like the fact that its commitment to doing meaningful innovation went all the way down to creating a 24-hour counter as well, which incidentally I use on my flight to Los Angeles, which was 16 hours.
Oh, really?
So a 12-hour counter would not have been enough. But let's talk about the 126-500 platform altogether, right? What is really remarkable to me is that Rolex has taken the Daytona and made it even more elegant, right? So you see a greater tapering angular, a faceting of the case. You see a thinness to the case, under 12 mm now.
Yes.
I believe it's 11.9 mm. Then you look at the dial, and there is so much beauty in this dial and elegance. If you look at the markers, they're thinner, but they're much more elegant.
Yeah.
If you look at the hands, they're more refined as well. And somehow this creates a dial that feels much more open and much better spaced.
Yes, it's true. Yeah.
Than its predecessor. If you look at it, right, it just feels refreshingly open.
It's refined. I think one thing that changes, one of the biggest changes in terms of, as you said, is the dial, right? The sub dials wise, I think the sub dial rings, has been thinned out as well.
Yes.
That gave it the more open space kind of look on the dial as well, which is, I think, a little bit reminisce to this guy here,
Absolutely.
With these thinner sub dials.
So the 88R series as well.
Yes.
Well, the other thing that's kind of cool about this as well is like this watch, and this also exists in the regular production, has a Serrochrome bezel in it. Obviously, the element that distinguishes this watch as a 100th anniversary Le Mans watch is the red 100 marker on the tachymeter. But regardless, all of the new watches have the Serrochrome bezel, but a metal ring on the exterior.
This is really super surprising.
And that's really interesting because that kind of like is a nod back to the 641, where you had like a metal ring.
Yes.
It was an acrylic insert to the bezel.
Yeah.
So I just love that as well. So the other thing to know about the 100th anniversary of Le Mans is that the watch is made of white gold. The cool thing about this watch is in some ways it's the ultimate stealth Daytona, right?
It is.
Because unless you really know what it is, unless you're looking out specifically for the square shaped hash marks, that telltale 100 in like red
on the bezel,
you're just going to think it's a normal Daytona, which incidentally is already an incredible watch, right?
It is, yeah.
But I think that this watch, first of all, representing the refinement of Rolex and its constant evolution towards greater and greater perfection, also its massive step up in terms of performance, and also the fact that it has, in such a bold way, really taken the Daytona and made it such a mature, high luxury watch as well, is such a wonderful celebration of this watch's heritage. So let's talk about that a little bit in general as well. One of the other things that I really like that Rolex has done over the last 10 years or so is the constant evolution towards refinement to making their watches more and more high luxury watches. Now, there's no brand that has a greater heritage in sports than Rolex, right?
Yeah.
But today, those watches are purely in the high luxury category, right? And it's interesting because when this watch was launched back in 2000, 24 years ago, Rolex was still kind of the ultimate luxury tool watch brand, right? Like people would take their Submariner or Sea Dweller diving, or
Yes.
And today, because of the refinement of those watches, you absolutely could, but most people wouldn't. So the brilliance of Jean-Fred Dufour, who's the CEO of Rolex, is he's like that gap as it has opened a little bit for the luxury tool watch. He's taken Tudor and placed it directly as the brand that represents it, and it's so smart. First of all, Tudor has unbeatable as a value proposition. There's no other watch that provides stronger value in the industry today. And then on top of that, amazing designs, amazing style, but it is actually perfectly in that price category between $3,000 to $5,000. Where if you want a watch that you can take and you can use as a beater or as a tool watch, that's the watch. And also be really excited and thrilled to wear something that's a beautifully designed, incredibly well made Swiss luxury watch too. Whereas Rolex has kind of ascended, in my perception, to high luxury. Right? And I think that's really well represented by a couple of other watches that was launched last year as well. One being the watch that I know that you and I have talked about a lot, which is the puzzle or the day-date with the emojis, and it's taken the day-date.
Such a crazy watch, man. To be honest.
But it's great because when the day-date was first created, it was giving you incredibly important information that was really hard to ascertain, right? But today, everyone knows kind of the day and the date because it's on your phone all the time. So they took that watch and said, okay, let's make it something fun, right? And they made something that was so wonderfully whimsical and so emotionally expressive that everyone fell in love with this.
Wow, my God. I didn't expect that to happen,
Absolutely love that watch.
Amazing watch.
So yes, ahead of the 2024 Watches and Wonders Fair, where we will see the new Rolex watches, and I guess there's a little bit of speculation as to what that can be, and I guess it'll increase. We wanted to bring to you this up-close look at what I consider to be possibly the greatest Daytona ever made, and that is the new Rolex Daytona reference 126529 white gold 100th anniversary of
24 hours counter
of the Le Mans race, 24-hour counter, and 60th anniversary of the Daytona watch. And so there you guys go. I hope you've enjoyed looking at this watch as much as I've enjoyed talking to you guys about it. And again, Rolex, you guys rock. Constant thank you for joining me.
Right. Thanks for sharing, Wei, and congratulations.
My pleasure, sir. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.